Alright guys, in our video today we're going to be looking a little further into histograms as far as how do we describe these histograms. We've got four sort of categories that we use when we describe a histogram. There's shape, center, spread, and outliers. First thing we're going to look at is shape. Well, as far as shape goes with histograms, the two pieces we're worried about with shape is symmetry. Another word for symmetry would be, we could call it evenness. Basically, can it be split in half and have both sides be the same? The second would be modality. Now, modality just is how many modes, or the number of peaks. You think about it like mountain peaks. How many peaks, mountain peaks are there? So let's look at our examples. Here in our first one, this first histogram, you'll see that it can be pretty much split evenly down the middle and be pretty much the same on each side. So we would say it is symmetric. It only has one peak, so we call that unimodal, which, as I said, means it has one peak. Okay. Our second histogram, it is still symmetric. We can pretty much split it down the middle, and it's the same on both sides, so it is still symmetric. This one now is what we call a bimodal. Okay. Meaning it has two peaks. And now our third example here, it is still pretty much symmetric. We can still pretty much split it in half, and it's very similar on both sides. So we would still say in general that it is symmetric. But this distribution doesn't really have any peaks. That's what we call a uniform distribution. It has no peaks. Now, the second piece of describing these is something we call skewness. Now, skewness simply means, is it shifted left or right? Now, if a histogram is skewed, it is no longer symmetric. Now, we always describe these in the direction that the sort of tail pulls off to. You can see this tail here pulls off to the right, so we call that skewed right. In our second histogram, you'll see the tail, as we can kind of call it, pulls off to the left, so we call this one skewed left. And that's skewness. Now, the next piece we're going to look at is the center. Center we can also think of as midpoint. We'll get a little more into the actual terms we're going to use for center for data later on. But basically, you can think of the midpoint as basically just the middle value. Okay, the center would be the middle value. If we look at this histogram here, I would say our middle value would probably be somewhere in this area. So it'd probably be around 70 or so. Okay. The last piece we're going to look at is what we call the spread. The spread of a histogram, another word for that is variability. How much is it variable? How much does it vary? Okay? The first piece of that is called the range. The range is simply just the maximum value minus the minimum value. All right? So for example, let's say we had a max in our histogram of 95, and we had a minimum value of 45. Well, then our range would just be equal to our max value minus our minimum value, which our range therefore would be 50. All right. The last piece we're going to look at with these histograms is something called outliers. An outlier is data that falls outside the overall pattern. So if we look at our histogram down here, you'll see our outlier labeled because it falls outside the normal shape of the rest of the histogram. Okay, it's sort of outside of the mountain, if you want to think about it like that. All right, so let's look at an example of describing a histogram. Well, in this histogram, first off, we need the shape. Well, I would say this histogram kind of tails off in general. The shape of it tends to tail off to the right. So I would say our histogram is skewed right. It's not symmetric. Okay? Our center, it's kind of hard to tell, but I'd probably guess it's around where that high peak is, around 32 or so. Okay? Now the spread. Well, the spread will simply be our max value, which in our case looks like it's around 80. Minus our minimum value, which looks like it might be 17 according to our graph. So our spread here would be about 63. Now as far as outliers, well, outside of the overall pattern, you'll see we have 62 possible, 74, 80. All of those are possible outliers. So I would say possibly 62, 74, and 80.